September 3rd, in the year of our Lord, 1666. 4 people walked through a destroyed building amidst the burning streets of London. Voices cried out in pain and loss. The smell of fire and sulfur infected the cruel east wind. Thick ash covered everything as a funeral veil. Imogene Jagger walked through the flames of her home and library, unburnt, as the inferno rose to the heavens around her. First the plague, now this. Oliver Rook stepped out from behind a collapsed bookshelf, his voice hardly audible over the roar of fire, wind, and screams. It was a mistake letting him practice here. Elsbeth Vereen Seeley was kneeling in the ashes, fire curling around her as she lifted a scorched tome from the floor. You act as if we had any power over him. What were we to do exactly? She asked through tears at seeing her life's work smoldering before her eyes. A man, Arthur Serpin, darkened the door of the ruined library and spoke in a commanding voice. The only power we have is what he gives us. You know the oaths we've sworn better than any of us, Elsbeth. Have you found him? Asked Imogene. I have, Arthur responded. He held up his right hand, and a gold ring upon it shined in a light brighter than the fires around them. The 3 others gathered around and laid their ringed hands atop his own. In a flash of flame and smoke, they were gone. Another man stood alone atop the steep shingled roof of St. Paul's Cathedral, watching the flames climb higher and higher into the night. His coat blew harshly ever eastward. He breathed in deeply, filling his lungs with the putrid smell. 4 beings appeared to his back in flame and smoke. My lord, the library is gone. We saved what we could, but the wards were not erected to protect against hellfire, Arthur said disdainfully, bowing to the man in front of him. So be it, the Lord said darkly. Do you wish to begin again? He asked the 4. Are you sure that is wise? Asked Oliver. Perhaps our work would be safer somewhere else, Elsbeth said. Perhaps. Their lord closed his eyes and breathed deeply once more. You still have much to learn, and much yet to accomplish. He opened his eyes as a brutal wind ripped the flames below into an even more fervent fury. We shall go. I sense a place far away. A safer place. Get your things in order. We will be gone before the smoke clears. He turned around and all 4 kneeled before him, proclaiming their allegiance to him and uttering, "Yes, my lord," in unison. My plans are far from over. Hello, and welcome to AcheronAudio. I hope that you will enjoy this story, and if you do, please leave a like and a comment. I would really appreciate it. To stay up to date on when new stories are released, please feel free to subscribe and click the notification bell. Without further ado, I implore that you listen and enjoy. Corveil's Journal. Every time I close my eyes, I'm there. When I hear the waves crash against the boat, I'm there. When I hear a bell sound or a horn blow or a gust of wind, I'm there. I'm not just talking about memory. I'm actually there, feeling it, breathing it, living it, seeing my brothers die, seeing myself take another life, seeing the shell land next to me, crawling my way back through the mud, through the wire, battling to stay conscious, lucid, sane. Then it all goes dark, and I snap out of it. But I still feel it. It's a physical presence, a ghost lurking, watching me, standing behind me, standing on my chest when I try to sleep, when I try to breathe. It's hungry. I can't beat it. I can't outrun it. I can't outsmart it. It's always there, just on the other side of my eyelids, right in my blind spot, right in every dark corner of every dark room that I can't quite make out. It's waiting. It's so hungry. The draft age was 21. Everyone told me I'd be fine, and I was, until they changed it. I had just turned 18 when they drew my name, shipped me to some sloppy boot camp, and then threw me into the meat grinder. The whole thing felt like a bad dream. I had no concept of how bad that dream would get. For being called the Great War, it only lasted a few short years. For some people, it still hasn't ended. As it turns out, a few short years is all it takes to create the largest scale catastrophe humanity has ever known. Over 15 million dead. It was a massacre. I never used to believe in ghosts, but it's hard not to now. I didn't even know the war was over until a few months later, once I finally woke up long enough for them to tell me that we won. We won. Overall, I guess I was lucky. I was only there long enough to see the sights, get blown apart by a shrapnel shell, and shipped back home on the next boat. I made it out with just a few bumps, bruises, a missing hand, and a nearly fatal head wound. At least it was the Huns that got to me, not the flu. By the time we got back to the States, the war was over, and I was in and out of a coma in a cramped hospital. Before the war, everyone always called me a promising young man. Now everyone treats me like a wounded animal. They smiled and glanced at the nub where my right hand used to be, then avoid eye contact like the plague. I was supposed to go to law school, but I guess they don't want damaged goods now. So there I was, wallowing in self-pity and drowning my sorrows in the cheapest bourbon or gin I could find, like any self-respecting man would, trying my best to ignore the ghost standing in the corner of the room when the letter came. It had a strange crest embossed on the stationery, an ornate four-pointed star with a calligraphic A emblazoned in the center. It came from some place called the Antumbra Academy of Art on Gloom Cleft Island off the coast of Salem. Now, I grew up in Salem, and I never heard mention of this place. Enclosed in the envelope was a letter in a pristine handwriting detailing a scholarship opportunity for veterans such as myself. I had never had much interest in art, but the ghost was getting restless, and this was something to pull me out of my stupor. Now I'm on a rusted old boat writing in a journal to stop myself from thinking, from remembering. I haven't the slightest clue what this school or my future holds, but there's only one way to find out. Chapter 1. Victor Corveil stood on the bow of the rusted passenger ferry, staring off into the fog. He could no longer see land behind him, nor their supposed destination. Amorphous shapes moved through the dark fog, making reference to the unimaginable horrors lurking within his subconscious. The knuckles on his left hand turned white as they tightened around the cold, wet railing. Thunder rolled in the distance. He let go of the railing and leaned forward, resting his forearm and the stub of his right hand against it and looking down into the foam below. It churned and rolled in sporadic chaos. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply of the damp sea air. The ship lurched, tossing him backwards away from the side of the boat. He reached out to catch himself with his right hand, which was no longer there. He hit the mud hard and a splash. Barbed wire surrounded him, and he heard screams through the orchestra of explosions and gunfire. He covered his ears and squeezed his eyes shut, adding his own scream to the symphony of terror around him. The pain in his chest was excruciating. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. He was drowning. He forced his eyes open and gasped for air, reaching his phantom right hand into the sky as if trying desperately to grab a lifeline. The sky was gray. He tasted salt on his lips. "Sir, are you all right, sir?" He heard a voice ask from behind him. He rolled over onto his stomach and lifted himself up as the sailor reached him and offered his right hand. Corveil glanced at it and sighed deeply, then grabbed it with his left, pulling himself to his feet. "I'm all right. I just lost my balance is all," he said. "Perhaps you should sit in the cabin until we get closer." Reluctantly, he nodded and let the sailor guide him back to the small cabin. He passed by the window leading into the cabin and saw the reflection of a man he hardly recognized. His hair was even shorter now than it was when he was in boot camp. The doctors insisted on keeping it short so that his wounds could properly heal. The scars on his head and face were red and raw, and the eyes that stared back at him were not the ones he remembered. He had light blue eyes that were often mistaken for gray, but now they just looked dark and lifeless. He entered the cabin, where he took a seat against the wall. He pulled out a journal that he had kept since he was released from the hospital. They claimed it would help him organize his thoughts as he waited to fully recover from the effects of his head injury. All it really did was help him realize how much of a mess his mind and life were. But it was something to do to pass the time, to keep his mind off of, well, everything. He glanced to the side while he dug through his thick wool coat. Two hollow eyes stared back at him from the corner. They shined with a dim glow, like a wild animal in the dark. His ghost, as he had taken to call it. The ghost of the men he had killed. The ghost of a version of himself that had died in the Argonne forest. Hateful eyes. At first, he did everything he could to avoid those eyes out of fear. But now, looking at them filled him only with regret and hatred for himself. Through the dim light, he could barely make out the emaciated form of the creature the eyes belonged to, starved and gaunt. He blinked, and the apparition was gone. He pulled the wooden fountain pen with the dull copper cap from the right inner pocket of his coat and began to jot down his thoughts. The handwriting was elementary and smudged from his left hand. Ink stained his sleeve and his hand, but he had gotten used to it over the past weeks. Time passed slowly as he wrote, but before too long, the captain called out "land" from the front of the cabin. He finished his thought, then capped his pen and held up his journal to blow on it in an attempt to dry the ink. He stood and walked towards the front of the small cabin and exited the room on the starboard side. He returned to the railing he had rested against earlier and scanned the dense fog. Dark shapes began to form from the oppressive gray, and gulls called out in the distance. The darkness took shape in harsh and jagged lines of rock. Steep, cruel cliffs came into view, waves violently beating against them, exploding into white mist like white phosphorus. He shuddered at the memories of trudging through the never-ending oceans of the burning gas. Boys screaming and dying as it melted their flesh and burned their lungs. Even through a gas mask, the pain was almost unbearable. He heard a bell ring in the distance as his mind was brought back to the present. The ship skirted around the side of the large island until a small dock came into view. The foghorn of the ship blasted, threatening to send Corveil into another episode, but he fought it. The half-healed burns and scars on his head flared in pain as he scrunched his face and covered his eyes. He was sure the sailors thought him a lunatic at this point, but he didn't care. The horn finally relented, and Corveil was able to regain a semblance of decorum as they pulled into the dock. Large stone structures rose into the distance, and many buildings in the Tudor style populated a small village near the dock. He found it hard to imagine that this island lurked so closely off the coast, and yet he had never heard or seen anything about it. It was far out past Baker's and Misery, yet this island was supposedly bigger than both. He walked to where the exit ramp would be placed, hiking up the canvas duffel slung around his shoulder. He hadn't brought much, just a few changes of clothes and other personal effects. He honestly didn't intend on staying here long. He just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. The boat docked, and sailors and dockhands tied the boat off and connected the ramp for him to disembark. Everything was eerily quiet, other than the waves beating against the cliffs nearby and the occasional screech of a gull. He had no idea what to expect from this place, but the closer he got, the more curious he became. This entire place had a rather mystical quality that he couldn't quite explain. He walked up the wooden dock and onto the cobbled street of the small coastal village. He walked past tall Tudor townhouses and shops, all seeming to be in various states of disrepair. Not that they were abandoned, just that the sea had not been kind to them. A slight drizzle of rain fell from the gray sky that grew increasingly darker and more angry. As he made his way through the small village center, he heard the blast of the ship's foghorn as it departed for the mainland. He shivered at the sound and at the rain. It was early spring, but the chill from the winter had yet to fully fall away. Small piles of slushy snow still huddled against the corners of buildings. The village seemed almost empty. Only candles and windows and the occasional plume of smoke from a chimney gave any indication of life. On the other side of the village was an old cobbled road that led into the highlands of the island. Thankfully, a signboard stood jutting from the rocks and snow nearby that gave him direction. Other than the small village and another on the far side of the island, it appeared mostly remote and uninhabited. The main exception being the sprawling star-shaped campus detailed atop the highland cliffs on the far east side of the island, where this road supposedly led. The map claimed that the campus was a 10-minute walk, so he started walking. The rain steadily increased as he journeyed across the island. He neared the crest of a hill and spotted spires reaching towards the sky, like jagged spikes erupting from the ground. The rest of the campus soon came into view, and the scope of the large area startled Corveil. The entire settlement was surrounded by a thick stone wall, adorned with ornate Gothic spikes. Beyond the wall, there were 3 large manor houses with incredible architecture. The center one was more of a castle than a manor, with platforms and ramparts climbing up its center tower. Dozens of smaller white and brown half-timbered buildings dotted the premises. He approached the wall. In front of him, its imposing pattern broke to form a metal archway supported by stone pillars. In the center of the metal arch was the same 4-pointed star with an A that had marked the letter he had received. A copper plaque embedded into the stone wall read, Antumbra Academy of Arcane Art, established in 1666 by the Fourrose family, dedicated to Arthur Serpin, Imogene Jagger, Elsbeth Vereen Seeley, and Oliver Rook. Corveil stopped in his tracks. Arcane art? He thought to himself. What have I gotten myself into? He steeled himself, then continued forward. Unlike the village by the docks, this place seemed to be bustling with life despite the rain. Students and professors walked swiftly from building to building. The men wore vests, hats, and slacks. The women wore blouses and skirts, each with long coats or umbrellas. Everyone's heads were down, reading books or sorting through research papers, trying to keep them dry. The kind of thing you would expect to see at university. Everyone engrossed in learning and education. The spring semester was clearly well underway. Corveil closed the distance to the imposing center structure until the sign on a smaller building to his right stood out to him. Office, Admission, and Administration, it read. He turned towards it and approached the wooden door next to where the sign hung. He lifted his hand to knock, but the door swung open on its hinges just before his knuckle met the wood. He furrowed his brow, expecting to see someone exiting from the other side, but there was no one. He blinked off his confusion and then stepped inside. "Come in, come in," a warm voice spoke from behind a tall desk to his left. Two sickly yellow eyes stared at him from the corner of the room, as always. The woman sitting behind the desk was a kindly-seeming older woman with thin wire-framed glasses atop her grayish-white-haired head. Her wrinkled smile was a warm welcome. A small sign sat atop the desk with the woman's name etched into it. "Hello, ma'am. My name is Victor Corveil. I received a letter."
"A pleasure to meet you, young man. May I see this letter?"
He reached his hand into his duffel and pulled out his journal in which he had stored the letter and placed it on the desk, sliding it near the woman. She picked it up.
"Let's see here. Just let me find my cheaters."
She began looking around her desk for the glasses atop her head. Corveil lifted his hand to his own head, miming the motion.
"All right, of course. Thank you, dear."
She pulled them down and then pushed and pulled the letter to and from her face to focus in on the words.
"Ah, yes,"
she said as she looked down and cross-referenced a list of names that sat on the desk next to her.
"Here we are. Victor Corveil. Served in the Marines, did you?"
she asked, smiling, then looked Corveil up and down, just noticing his scars and wounds for the first time. Her face grew solemn. "Yes, ma'am," he said after glancing down.
"Oh dear, I'm sorry, I didn't see. Well, no matter. Everything seems to be in order. Are you looking to enroll or just taking a look around?"
"Just having a look," he said.
"Ah."
She reached down and pulled a slim form out of a drawer to her right.
"That being the case, I'll just need you to sign these waivers."
She slid them towards him on the desk. "Waivers?" he asked. "What for?" She shifted in her chair.
"Well, you see, we do lots of academic research here, and not all of said research is publicly available, shall we say. It's just a simple precaution."
He quickly glanced through the document before him. He had never seen such a thing before. Though he never studied law at the university level, he had done his fair share of preparations for it. But a document binding someone to silence was unheard of. Such things were generally seen as common sense, and most judges would side with the accuser if such information were to get out. It wasn't a bad idea to have such agreements in written form. It merely caught him off guard, though he didn't see any harm in agreeing to it. He signed his messy and smudged signature on the bottom of the paper and slid it back across the desk.
"Wonderful. Now if you'll just follow Howard, he will show you around campus."
She motioned to the same corner where Corveil's ghost sat perched. When he followed her gesture, he saw the same eyes and watched as they slowly blinked, and a man stood up from the shadowed corner. Corveil took a step back, startled at first. Had he completely missed this man when he walked in, and instead mistook him for his own delusion? This was becoming a problem. The man that stood before him was tall and gaunt. His shadowed gray eyes stared at him from his oblong face. His lips seemed pulled into a constant thin line. The strange man wore a sharp dark gray suit and green necktie. He offered his right hand to Corveil. Corveil looked down at it, and then reached his left hand over and pulled up the sleeve of his coat, revealing the stub underneath. This Howard glanced down as well, then retracted his hand and spoke in a high, eerie voice.
"If you'll follow me."
He walked past Corveil and out the door into the rain.